Imagine this. You're at St. Mary's Medical Center in downtown Denver on a busy Tuesday afternoon. The hospital corridors are filled with the usual activity. Nurses rushing between patient rooms, doctors reviewing charts, visitors carrying flowers to loved ones. The pediatric wing is especially busy, with children's laughter echoing from the playroom and worried parents waiting in consultation rooms. Then suddenly, the peaceful atmosphere is shattered by a sound no one ever wants to hear in a hospital. Gunshots echoing through the main lobby, followed by screaming and the hospital's emergency lockdown alarm. The intercom crackles with the security director's terrified voice. Code Silver. Active shooter in the building. All units to lockdown positions. If there are any law enforcement or military personnel on premises, please respond immediately. Panic spreads through the hospital like wildfire. Patients, visitors, and staff are running in every direction, trying to find safe places to hide. But in the pediatric wing supply closet, a quiet man in his 40s slowly sets down his mop and looks up from the floor he's been cleaning. He's wearing a simple hospital maintenance uniform with Miguel Santos custodial service embroidered on the chest. To everyone who passes him in the halls, he's just another invisible hospital worker. Nobody knew his real identity. Nobody knew what he was truly capable of. His name was Master Sergeant Miguel Guardian Santos, and he was about to prove that some heroes wear scrubs instead of uniforms. What none of the 847 patients, visitors, and staff realized was that the man they'd been walking past without a second glance was actually the most decorated combat medic in Army Special Forces history. A soldier who had saved over 500 lives in Afghanistan and Iraq, who had performed surgery under enemy fire, who had carried wounded soldiers through active minefields when evacuation was impossible. Miguel had been working as a hospital janitor for 18 months, hiding from a military career that had ended when he couldn't save the life that mattered most to him. He was living under his real name but concealing his military background, avoiding anything that reminded him of his former calling. The man who had once been fearless in combat now couldn't even watch medical dramas on TV without having panic attacks. But when those gunshots echoed through St. Mary's Medical Center, something deeper than fear took control of his actions. Miguel dropped his cleaning supplies and moved toward the sound of gunfire, not away from it. His body automatically shifted into combat mode, low crouch, scanning for threats, evaluating tactical positions. Other people saw a janitor responding to crisis, but Miguel was operating with the instincts of a Special Forces medic who had survived 73 combat missions. When he reached the main lobby, what he found was worse than he had imagined. A lone gunman, later identified as 34-year-old Marcus Webb, a former patient who had lost his wife to medical complications, had entered the hospital with an assault rifle and over 300 rounds of ammunition. And Webb wasn't conducting a random shooting. He was systematically hunting for the medical team he blamed for his wife's death, moving floor by floor, room by room. But the pediatric wing was directly in his path, and 23 children were trapped in the playroom with no way to escape. "Where is Dr. Harrison?" Webb was shouting at terrified staff. "Where is the surgeon who killed my wife? I'm going to make him watch everyone die before I kill him." Miguel assessed the tactical situation with the cold precision that had made him legendary among Special Forces medics. The gunman was 40 yards away, heavily armed, and positioned between the children and all possible exits. Police response would take at least 8 minutes, and SWAT deployment would take 20 minutes minimum. In 20 minutes, 23 children would be dead unless someone acted immediately. Miguel made his way to the pediatric wing, using service corridors that only hospital maintenance staff knew about. When he reached the trapped children, he found them huddled together with 2 pediatric nurses, Jessica Martinez and Robert Kim, who were trying to keep them calm while barricading the playroom door. "Who are you?" whispered Nurse Martinez as Miguel slipped into the room. Miguel looked at the faces of 23 terrified children, some as young as 4 years old, others fighting cancer, several connected to IV poles and medical equipment they couldn't leave behind. "Someone who's going to get everyone out safely," he said quietly. What Miguel didn't tell the nurses was that he was absolutely terrified. 18 months ago, Miguel had been the senior medic on a Special Forces team conducting a humanitarian mission in Afghanistan. They had been providing medical care to civilians in a remote village when Taliban fighters attacked the clinic. Miguel had successfully evacuated 47 Afghan civilians, but he hadn't been able to save 6-year-old Amina Rashid, a little girl who reminded him of his own daughter back home. And Amina had died in Miguel's arms from injuries he couldn't treat with the medical supplies available. Her death had shattered something inside Miguel that all his previous combat experience hadn't touched. He had resigned from the army, moved to Denver, and taken a job that would keep him away from life-or-death medical situations. Now, facing 23 children who needed his protection, Miguel had to overcome the trauma that had driven him away from medicine and remember how to be the warrior healer he used to be. Miguel began the most dangerous medical evacuation of his career, using techniques that combined Special Forces tactics with pediatric medical knowledge. The playroom had 2 exits. The main door that led directly toward the gunman's position. Miguel knew the balcony well from his custodial work. It was accessed through the hospital's ventilation system, and it could support the weight of multiple people if they moved carefully. But evacuating 23 children through a window 15 feet off the ground, several of them attached to medical equipment, while an active shooter hunted for them, required precision that went far beyond normal emergency procedures. Nurse Martinez, I need you to help me with the children who can walk on their own. Nurse Kim, you handle the medical equipment for the patients who can't be separated from their IVs. Miguel instructed with the authority of someone who had commanded medical evacuations under impossible conditions. Are you law enforcement? Asked Nurse Kim. Army Special Forces medic, retired. I've done evacuations like this before, but never with pediatric patients. Miguel replied, already calculating weight distributions and rope configurations in his head. What Miguel attempted next had never been tried in a civilian medical emergency. Using maintenance supplies and medical equipment, Miguel created an improvised rappelling system that would allow him to lower children, one at a time, from the playroom window to the loading dock below. Each child would need to be secured in a makeshift harness, with medical patients requiring special accommodations for IV lines and monitoring equipment. I need everyone to listen very carefully, Miguel announced to the children, keeping his voice calm and reassuring despite the gunshots that could be heard getting closer. We're going to play a special game where everyone gets to fly like superheroes. I'm going to help each of you get down to the ground safely, but you have to follow my instructions exactly. The first child to go was 8-year-old Emma Chen, who had been receiving chemotherapy treatment when the lockdown began. Miguel secured her in a harness made from maintenance rope and medical restraints, making sure her IV line could travel with her during the descent. Are you really going to catch me? Emma asked, looking down at the 15-foot drop. Miguel smiled through his own fear. I promise you, Emma, I've caught hundreds of people in places much scarier than this. You're going to be perfectly safe. But halfway through Emma's descent, Miguel heard something that made his blood freeze. Webb's voice in the corridor outside the playroom, getting closer with each step. I know there are children in here somewhere, Webb was shouting. The doctors who killed my wife need to see what it feels like to lose innocent people. Miguel had to make a split-second decision that would determine whether 22 more children lived or died. He could continue the slow, careful evacuation process and risk Webb finding them, or he could attempt something that violated every safety protocol but might get everyone out before the gunman reached them. Miguel chose to accelerate the evacuation, using a technique he had developed for emergency helicopter extractions in combat zones. Nurse Martinez, I need you to take the 3 lightest children and prepare them for simultaneous descent. And Nurse Kim, grab the medical emergency bag and get ready to rappel with the last group. We're going to get everyone out in the next 4 minutes. What Miguel did next required physical strength and coordination that seemed impossible for a single person. He managed multiple descent lines simultaneously, lowering groups of children while maintaining medical care for those who needed IV medications, all while listening for the approaching gunmen and preparing for potential combat if Webb discovered their location. The 4th group included 5-year-old Carlos Rodriguez, who was recovering from surgery and connected to pain medication through an IV pump. Miguel had to coordinate the boy's descent with the medical equipment, ensuring that his post-operative care wasn't interrupted even during the emergency evacuation. But the most challenging evacuation was yet to come. 10-year-old Ashley Thompson was in the playroom because she was waiting for her father, Dr. James Thompson, the cardiac surgeon that Webb was specifically hunting. Ashley had heard Webb shouting her father's name and understood that she was in danger not just because of the shooting, but because of who her father was. "He's looking for my daddy," Ashley whispered to Miguel as he prepared her evacuation harness. "Is my daddy going to be okay?" Miguel looked into the eyes of a little girl whose father was being hunted by a gunman, and he made a promise that went beyond the evacuation. "Ashley, I'm going to make sure both you and your daddy are safe. And that's what I do. I protect people." But as Miguel began Ashley's descent, Webb's voice came from directly outside the playroom door. "I know you're in there. Open this door, or I'll shoot through it." Miguel had approximately 30 seconds before Webb would break down the door and discover that most of the children had escaped. But Ashley was still suspended halfway between the window and the loading dock, and Nurse Kim was preparing to descend with the last 3 children. That's when Miguel made a decision that combined his Special Forces training with a father's instinct to protect children. He was going to draw Webb away from the playroom by making himself the primary target. Miguel ensured that Ashley reached the loading dock safely, then positioned himself between the playroom door and the window where Nurse Kim was evacuating the last children. He had no weapons, no body armor, and no backup. Just his medical training and the knowledge that 23 children's lives depended on buying Kim enough time to complete the evacuation. "Marcus Webb." Miguel called out through the door. "My name is Master Sergeant Miguel Santos, U.S. Army Special Forces. I know you're in pain about losing your wife. I've lost people too. Let's talk about this." The shooting stopped. Webb's voice came through the door, now confused and cautious. "You're military? And what are you doing here?" "I work here now. I've seen a lot of people die, Marcus. I know what that guilt feels like. But killing children won't bring your wife back." Miguel was using psychological tactics he had learned for dealing with hostile situations in combat zones, but he was applying them to a grieving man whose pain had driven him to violence. Every word Miguel spoke was calculated to keep Webb talking while Nurse Kim finished evacuating the last children. "She died because they didn't care," Webb shouted. "The doctors were too busy, too important to save her." "I understand," Miguel replied, checking to make sure the last child had safely reached the loading dock. "I lost a little girl in Afghanistan because I didn't have the right equipment to save her. The guilt nearly destroyed me, but hurting other people won't fix what's broken inside us." Webb was quiet for almost a minute. Then, "How do you live with it?" Miguel realized that he was having a conversation about trauma and survivor guilt with an armed man who had already shot several people, while standing in a children's playroom that he had just evacuated using techniques developed for military combat zones. It was the most surreal moment of his military or civilian career. "You live with it by finding ways to honor the people you couldn't save," Miguel said honestly. "You dedicate your life to making sure other people don't experience the same loss. You turn your pain into purpose." Through the window, Miguel could see police cars arriving at the hospital. SWAT teams would be deployed soon, but Webb was still armed and dangerous, and there were hundreds of other people in the hospital who could become targets if the situation escalated. "Marcus, I want you to know that all the children are safe, and you didn't hurt any of them. That means something. It means you're not the kind of person who hurts innocent people, no matter how much pain you're in." The door handle turned slowly, and Webb stepped into the playroom. He was carrying an assault rifle, but it was pointed at the floor. His face showed exhaustion, grief, and confusion rather than rage. Miguel assessed the tactical situation. Webb was 12 feet away, emotionally unstable, but not in an immediately threatening posture. Miguel had spent years learning to read body language in high-stress situations, and Webb looked more like a broken man than an active threat. "The children are really safe?" Webb asked. "And all 23 of them. They're with paramedics now, getting checked out, but none of them were harmed." And Webb looked around the empty playroom. Toys scattered on the floor, small chairs overturned, children's drawings still hanging on the walls. "I didn't want to hurt kids. I couldn't handle the doctors acting like my wife's death didn't matter." Miguel stepped closer, moving slowly and keeping his hands visible. "Marcus, your wife's death mattered. Her life mattered. But this isn't going to honor her memory or ease your pain. You know that." For the next 8 minutes, Miguel conducted an informal psychological debriefing with an armed gunman, using techniques he had learned for helping soldiers deal with combat trauma and survivor guilt. It was the most unusual application of military medical training in civilian emergency response. When SWAT officers finally entered the playroom, they found Webb sitting on the floor with his weapons set aside, crying while Miguel sat next to him, talking quietly about grief, loss, and finding ways to heal instead of causing more pain. The shooting was over without any additional casualties, and all 23 children were safely evacuated. But Miguel's most important work was just beginning. The investigation. His shooting spree had been a desperate attempt to make someone pay for his loss, but Miguel's intervention had helped him recognize that violence wouldn't solve his underlying trauma. Miguel spent the next several hours working with crisis negotiators, psychiatrists, and Webb himself to ensure that the gunman received proper mental health treatment rather than simply being processed through the criminal justice system. "Why did you help him?" asked Dr. Sarah Kim, the hospital's chief psychiatrist. "He came here to kill people, including children." Miguel looked through the window at the pediatric ward, where all 23 children were safe with their families. "Because hurt people, and sometimes healing people can help heal other people. That's what I learned in Afghanistan, and that's what I remembered today." But the story that captured national attention wasn't Miguel's crisis intervention with Webb. It was his evacuation of 23 children using improvised medical rescue techniques that had never been attempted in civilian emergency response. Videos taken by hospital security cameras showed Miguel moving through the crisis with precision and calm that seemed impossible under the circumstances. News organizations called it the most skillful civilian evacuation in modern emergency response history. Miguel was offered positions with SWAT teams, emergency response units, and private security companies. And news programs wanted to interview him, military organizations wanted to honor him, and the hospital wanted to promote him to head of emergency preparedness. But Miguel made a different choice. He returned to his job as a hospital janitor, but with a new mission that transformed how St. Mary's Medical Center approached emergency preparedness and trauma response. Miguel began training hospital staff in techniques that combined medical knowledge with crisis management skills developed for military combat zones. His programs taught nurses, doctors, and support staff how to evacuate patients safely during emergencies, how to provide medical care under dangerous conditions, and how to recognize and respond to trauma in both patients and colleagues. But the most important program Miguel created was one that the public never heard about: a support group for hospital staff, emergency responders, and military veterans who were struggling with survivor guilt and professional trauma. "Every life you save matters," Miguel would tell group members. "But every life you can't save teaches you something that might help you save the next person. The guilt isn't a weakness. It's proof that you care enough to keep trying." Over the next 3 years, emergency response techniques developed by Miguel's training programs saved hundreds of lives in hospital crises across the country. His methods for patient evacuation and crisis management became standard protocols in pediatric medical centers nationwide. But Miguel's greatest achievement wasn't in the lives saved by his techniques. It was in the healthcare workers he helped overcome their own trauma and continue serving patients despite the emotional toll of their work. Today, Master Sergeant Miguel Guardian Santos continues to work as a hospital janitor at St. Mary's Medical Center, but he also serves as the Director of Emergency Preparedness and Staff Wellness. He keeps in his office a photo of 6-year-old Amina Rashid, the little girl who died in his arms in Afghanistan and whose memory had driven him away from medicine. But the photo isn't there as a reminder of his failure. It's there as a reminder that sometimes the people we can't save guide us toward the people we can help heal. Next to Amina's photo is a drawing from Ashley Thompson showing Miguel as a superhero with a mop instead of a cape, and the words, "Thank you for keeping us safe, Mr. Miguel." The man who thought he would never practice medicine again became the teacher who showed others that healing comes in many forms, sometimes with surgery and medication, sometimes with evacuation techniques and crisis management. Sometimes they carry mops and cleaning supplies, moving through hospitals invisible to most people, but ready to become guardians when children need protecting and broken people need healing. Life is unpredictable, and you never know when the person mopping the floor next to you might be the one who saves everyone when disaster strikes. Miguel Santos didn't ask for recognition or praise, but when 23 children needed a guardian angel, he proved that the most ordinary-looking people can possess the most extraordinary courage. Sometimes the most broken among us become the most powerful healers. Sometimes the people who are running from their calling find it again when others need them most. And sometimes, the person who thinks they have nothing left to offer becomes exactly the hero the world needs. If this story moved you, remember that there are guardians all around us, hiding in plain sight, carrying skills and courage that could save the day when we least expect it. The janitor, the maintenance worker, the person whose job seems invisible, they might be the one who steps forward when everything goes wrong. Don't forget to like, share this story with someone who needs to know that heroes are everywhere, and subscribe for more powerful stories about the hidden guardians who keep us safe every day.